Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. Cybersecurity and payment security are critical topics impacting organizations today. Strategic Treasurer's managing partner Craig Jeffery discusses some perspectives on security that matters to payment, IT, and Treasury professionals. Listen in as he shares valuable insights on fraud and covers some recent cyber and payment fraud events. Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. I'm Meredith Zonzias, Communications Manager at Strategic Treasurer, and today's host. Today I'll be talking with Craig Jeffery, our managing partner and founder, who will be sharing on an update on cyber fraud and payment security. Cybersecurity and payment security is a serious topic, and one of which we started out with a number of episodes earlier on the Treasury Update podcast. We have touched on the topics a few times since then. It is time to refresh what is going on and discuss some perspectives on Treasury that matter to payment, IT, and Treasury professionals. Today we'll cover perspectives on fraud and recent cyber fraud events. I'd like to kick off the conversation with fraud. Can you give me a refresher on your perspective of fraud?
I'm against it.
You are against it. That's a good thing.
Yeah, I think cyber fraud is a significant event that's absorbing more resources and needs to take on more attention and focus for a lot of organizations. I mean, just a quick background on the perspective. The situation is that the fraud is a persistent, ongoing threat. It's automated, that the criminals are using very sophisticated automated means of attacking organizations, so they're leveraging automation. The sophistication is not just with technology, but it's sophisticated in its approach, its language, and the different attack methods they use. It's targeted to individual companies, as well as there's a broad net cast for all organizations to see who bites. And the other element is it's adaptive. They're adding to different capabilities of committing fraud, theft of information, theft of funds, lockdown of information, et cetera. So they continue to adapt their approaches. So it no longer is just business email compromise, it's system attacks, it's vishing, the use of voice, even smishing, the use of SMS messages to gain control, to gain a foothold, and then expand from there. So that's part of the perspective. That's the situation of the challenge. The view that I have is that based on our data and research is that organizations are spending more to protect themselves against fraud in a number of different ways. Organizations feel very strongly that they're in a much better position vis-a-vis where they were a year ago based on survey data. So they feel that they protected themselves more. They feel that the threat has increased significantly in the past year, in the past 2 years, and yet we still have massive losses. So the actual results are not any better. So we have the attack is increasingly becoming sophisticated. People feel more comfortable because they've been spending on it, and yet losses are still just as large, just as significant, and sometimes in some cases they're even more significant. It's bad because the threat is so adaptive and growing, and the losses are there. So that you've heard me say crime does pay because the payoff is so great. And they're leveraging tools that we use in our business or concepts we use in business for efficiency and expansiveness. They're using that to create these crimes.
How should companies and organizations be thinking about this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because if we said people are spending more, they're taking it more serious. They're recognizing that the threat has increased, but the fact that there's losses means that we need to challenge we're in a better position. I think because the level of threat keeps increasing, what was a great position becomes a good position, becomes below the standard of good corporate conduct for protecting against fraud. And this is from a system perspective and from a human element, the human element and the system elements that exist there. So what this means in summary is that we can't rest on our laurels. We can't say, everything's fine. We've reached a level of security. we need to not be as positive. We're in a better position. We've improved our position, and we're at least holding ground might be a more accurate interpretation for those that have strengthened their defenses. But I think it needs to be perspective on we have to continually adapt. How are we making improvements reflective of increased sophistication of threat, increased automation of threats, new methods of attack? And so there can't be resting on laurels. It has to be a bit of a war room for every company, whether it's payables, IT, treasury, across the board, in terms of data, in terms of funds.
So focusing on the two elements, what can we do as responsible business owners or employees?
Yeah, so the two elements being human and technology. So, the concept of if I can defeat the system, that might be harder. It might be a harder challenge than if I can defeat the humans that are there, the different people in the organization. Criminals are lazy to an extent. They're going to follow the weakest link. And then as you make it harder, they're going to adapt and find more sophisticated, better ways of adapting. And so there's been a tremendous amount of success with business email compromise as the broader term. This is the CEO or imposter fraud. You are able to convince someone through some communication method that you were a particular person or a particular company, and instructions can be altered, changed, or given in that way. So whether it's via compromised email, it could be phone system, it can be through the mail, the regular mail. This type of attack of spoofing as to who you are and pretending to be someone else really targets the human element, that people will believe it. And since the sophistication has increased, that's a bigger issue. Now, there are certainly some technical sides that can help that, but there's also some human elements that exist. Humans can help defeat the layers of defense you have. They can defeat a system control. They can unlock doors when they go out for a vape break or whatever they're doing. There's ways to defeat that. So we have to have multiple layers. We have to make sure people are trained and they realize the seriousness of that. That's the human. And part of that, too, I think, is it's how do people become aware? They need to be trained regularly with testing, and that has to be serious with regards to payment security. Most organizations are increasingly attentive to the protecting the crown jewels of data, but they're not always focused on what does that mean from a payment perspective. How do we protect data, payment processes, payment information, items related to that? That has to be serious training and testing on the human side. On the technology side, there's a lot of discussions about what people need to do. The last little bit, we've focused on two principles that we see are ignored or not used as heavily as they should be. And this represents an opportunity for better defense and a challenge to those who aren't. And I'll just go through those quickly. So one is the principle of least privilege. The second is monitoring. The principle of least privilege is less well known than you would think than perhaps segregation of duties. Everyone knows, you don't give one person the ability to issue a payment on their own. You have two people that have to sign off paper or sign off in a system. So the principle of least privilege has some similarities to that in terms of restricting access to data, to systems, to files, to functions. This principle is not consistently covered. And where we see this one violated in lots of ways in organizations, but a couple concepts here I think can help, as the listener looks at their organization. One is each area tends to trust their people more than others. So when IT is restricting access, they know to restrict people involved in the payment process. You can't access this directory, or you can do something else. And so they restrict payroll or HR resources or treasury to directories that they can't access because it's outside their area. Yet they tend to grant that access to all of these system admins or support areas because they have to do that in case there's a problem and they have to fix something for a payment. So they've created a situation where there's greater trust for their own group. Treasury does this as well. Everybody does this on their own. They trust their own group and oftentimes grant excess privileges. When I say oftentimes, that there are some areas where excessive access is given. And the problem isn't that IT is more or less trustworthy than treasury is less or more trustworthy than another area. It's that you then have an ID or a set of credentials that by themselves has more access, more privilege than is necessary. So someone gains control of that set of credentials, and now they have access to more of a system or more functions. They can see more of it to learn when they're in the surveillance mode, or they can do more when they're in the production mode. And part of that stems too when you think about access and rights. If someone's trying to get into an organization to surveil what's going on inside the organization, to gain knowledge and insight and learn before they commit their fraud or their theft of data, their theft of money, they try to gain a foothold somewhere. Once they gain a foothold, they try to leap areas from one area to another. So they get the beachhead, and then they'll move laterally through an organization to see what else is going on, learn, grant rights, etc. The more you have the principle of least privilege set up there, the harder it is for them to move laterally. And this needs to be understood across the board, whether you're a treasury person assigning rights through portals and through through different areas of the organization, or your IT, that you have to take that principle seriously for all areas, not just for areas outside your particular group. So on the monitoring side, you can think about monitoring in every area from physical access to system setup or accessing different files, client records, payment systems, etc. The principle of monitoring can include at a system level anomaly detection. And you can set up anomalies with some software. You can set up rules that say if a vendor master record is changed or payment information on a repetitive wire or repetitive payment is changed, anytime there's a payment that goes out within 30 days, 15 days, whatever, that it's going to be flagged and require extra validation that it's alerted. You're alerted to the fact that key information has changed. Now payment is going out. So that can be set up a rule like that. You can see how that would make sense. But you can also use some of these tools. They use AI and machine learning to see what users are actually doing. This can create the standard view of what's being done, how many records are being accessed in an hour, where a user goes in a system, what are the functions that they do. Across the board, it can lay out and understand what a person does in the system or what a particular IDs do. And that creates, here's the standard process or the range of what the standard process is. And because it develops that standard, the system can now identify anything that falls outside that, 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, 3. So, 400 records were accessed within 2 minutes. That is the most that we ever saw was 6 in 2 minutes, and now we saw 400. Well, a system is, gaining, accessing, looking at data, trying to get it ready for exfiltration or just observe it. So those are two, the principle of least privilege and monitoring, that we see as leading organizations are paying more attention to those, and others that aren't leading are falling behind, and that's the biggest opportunity for them.
Would these principles vary across different company sizes, or would you say that every small to large business needs to take it seriously?
Well, the principle of least privilege really applies across the board, regardless of size. But how it may be implemented could look different. If you're in a really large organization, you tend to have more people doing specialized functions. So it's just due to the size and activity, some of that naturally gets put in place. But that is something that, whether it's physically managed, manually established, or system controlled, both size organizations or all size organizations need to look at that, how you grant access to files, data, et cetera. The monitoring side, that looks a lot different, or can look a lot different from one size organization to another. A small organization, maybe running on QuickBooks or a Microsoft accounting platform, and may have almost everything running in the cloud, and they're not going to be setting up as much anomaly detection software internally because most of it's running in the cloud. So they may use some of the web-type tools for that if that type of organization is running a lot of their application, their environment in the cloud. Other organizations may have a very large, network. Many things are running internally, and so for those type of organizations, they're oftentimes getting or should get software that learns behaviors, detects that, builds cases, helps resolve those capture items and suspend it, and builds it into the process. And so, that can really look different from one organization to another.
What are some of the cyber and payment fraud events?
Yeah, some of the recent ones, I'll just go through a couple. This is not meant to scare anybody, but to just talk about some of the items of magnitude of recent times. So ransomware, we'll talk about a couple instances here. So April 2008, the city of Atlanta experienced ransomware. It locked down a number of their departments. Cleanup, as the estimate is that it's already over 17 million. I don't know if we have a final accounting for that, but 17 million is real money to try to resolve that. Baltimore, leaping forward 13 months into May of this year, May 2019, their cleanup is north of 18 million. And you've probably heard or seen that in the news if you're in the U.S. Those are two large cities that have had a pretty significant impact. And then in August of 2019, there was a number of Texas municipalities. The number it's reflected now is 22 Texas towns and cities. So 22 of them were subjected to the ransomware attack. A lot of information was locked down. Very, very significant, very costly. Someone, perhaps a nation-state actor, was able to leverage some communication tools to get at a bunch of them all at once. So that's ransomware. I'll touch on business email compromise as another example. So in September of 2019, there was a $37 million loss, and this was against a subsidiary of Toyota. This was one of the car parts supplier that they own, Toyota Boshuku. There was fraudulent supplier payment misdirection, where they were able to get that entity to redirect payments to a different account, an account that they had some control over, and those funds were transferred. They were able to get those funds redirected and removed out of the banking system. So that's a very significant item when you think about that happened in September of 2019. After this has been occurring for a long time, and at that magnitude, the attacks are relentless, and it's not surprising to see this all the time. Every week I hear about more events. These are ones that have hit the news. A couple other ones. So phishing, the voicemail or voice alteration, spoofing someone with voice. Now, you can copy recordings from earnings report. Usually it's from organizational leaders, but there's also been some recent examples with using artificial intelligence to take these recordings and create messages from an organization's CEO. That gets delivered, you get a message, it's the CEO's voice, or it sounds exactly like it, telling you to do certain things, that they're leaving, etc. And so they're using and leveraging AI tools to commit fraud. These are significant issues, long-time issues. Ransomware has been around for about 3 years. Business email compromise has been around longer than that, but it's still having tremendous success. I won't go through some of the larger system-level hacks that have occurred. Not too many of them have reached the news of late, but the attack and attempt levels continue very, very heavily. So those are some of the cyber and payment fraud events. I'll just give you a quick update at the end on the two industry standards for cyber fraud, security, defense. The Payment Card Institute, the PCI DSS standard, requires annual training and activities and certification for protecting card information. So this is a standard that's been out for quite some years and continues to increase. We still see some organizations serious about it, recognizing they can't do it, moving the card data out of their organization so that they're not housing it. But we also see some organizations not taking it as seriously as they should. Large retailers do because they're under constant attack. On the SWIFT side, the SWIFT Customer Security Program, or SWIFT CSP, now in its third year, it's expanded the number of standards and requirements, and now there's additional expectations placed upon the users, whether it'll be reported or not, new standards and actions that are required to be considered compliant with that. So we continue to see those standards increase in complexity and capability, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see some other standards come out from other payment systems, whether it's Notch in the U.S. or other platforms that are perhaps platform specific to protect the payment process.
Any final thoughts on how organizations can guard against fraud?
I think every organization above a very small organization needs to have a group that's focused on cyber defense and protecting against this criminal activity. And it needs to include people from some of the different disciplines, IT, data security, treasury, accounts payable, human resources, to share what's going on. What are they doing? How do they need to protect the organization? We would expect IT to understand how to have sufficient firewalls to make sure that those are prepped and in place, updated regularly. We'd expect Treasury to take ownership of the payment process and know and make sure that the different actors with responsibility for different parts are doing what's needed to be done to protect that. And this would be, from accounting platforms or ERP systems, from the Treasury system and portals, from the different system level controls, transaction level controls, end-to-end controls, et cetera, that are necessary to do that. So I think the concept is, how are you instituting a machine that will ensure you're always updating your capabilities on cyber defense? You're always learning. You're always making sure that the humans and the machines are doing what's necessary to be protective against this ongoing sophisticated threat. You got to know what the threat is, how it's changing, and you have to up your defenses. And this requires planned action, not just plain defense, whenever something comes up.
Thank you for sharing this critical information, Craig. Thanks for tuning in to the Treasury Update podcast. If you have any topics you'd like to learn more about, please submit us a request at podcast@strategictreasurer.com. That's podcast@strategictreasurer.com. Thanks for tuning in.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.